I'm Edward Sturton, and in this special programme here on the BBC World Service, I'll be considering the life of Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth, whose death has been announced by Buckingham Palace. Prince Philip was in the business of monarchy. He joined the firm, as it's popularly known, in the gloom years of post-war Britain, when the monarchy took for granted public adoration. He left it when those simple days had gone, and the monarchy had created its own celebrity in the era of social media. It was a long life of public service, so long that many of those you'll hear in this programme are themselves dead. Prince Philip was ever at the Queen's side through her silver, golden and diamond jubilees, at the death of her sister and her mother, through the successive courtroom and media debacle caused in large part by the behaviour of their own children and the revelations of certain staff. He was, too, the ever-familiar figure in the royal public choreography of coaches and carriages, some 300 official visits a year, and the supreme command performances, the memorable scarlet and gold balcony scenes. Despite his royal pedigree, not always admired by the British establishment, constitutionally he didn't exist. So the popular idea was a handsome, penniless prince with no real job. His biographer, Tim Heald, thought there was more to it than that.
There are some extraordinary genealogical tables originally compiled by Lord Mountbatten at the palace. You sort of score points for the number of royal houses you're descended from, and he rated 8 against the Queen's 6. So he was very royal, and he always felt that. People always assumed that he didn't like being one pace behind the Queen all the time, and they always drew attention to the fact that in public he always seemed to be at her elbow, always second fiddle, and therefore must be terribly frustrated. I don't think that was his view. He was royal enough to know exactly what he was letting himself in for in 1947 when he married the then Princess Elizabeth. He always said to me that he regarded his primary function as making it possible for the Queen to be Queen. So he saw himself in a serious support role.
Hang on to that reference to Lord Mountbatten, Prince Philip's uncle, the Eminence grise. Philip was born on the dining room table of a grand villa in Corfu in 1921. His father was Prince Andrew of Greece, with the family name of Oldenburg, his grandfather King of Greece, and the second son of Christian IX of Denmark. Prince Philip's blood was a royal cocktail, German, Danish, and a dash of Russian, colourful stuff. Yet Britain wasn't completely foreign to him. After all, his mother, Princess Alice, was born at Windsor Castle. She suffered a mental and religious crisis during Prince Philip's early years. That, together with the highly volatile political situation in Greece, which saw his father just avoid being executed during a Greco-Turkish conflict, meant his childhood was extremely disrupted. When Philip came to Britain, not yet 2 years old, he'd escaped to what was hardly a promised land. Tim Heald again.
Into exile at 18 months in an orange basket on board a British destroyer. Mother and father splitting up when you're 10 years old. All your 4 sisters marrying that same year. Tossed from pillar to post, sent to pretty Spartan, difficult preparatory schools in England, which is not your home country anyway. Various people dying at inconvenient moments. I mean, a favourite sister killed in an air crash when he was about 15 or 16. Marquis of Milford Haven, who was effectively his guardian in England, died of cancer when, again, he was in his late teens. So, of course he was royal. Of course he was privileged in certain ways, but in a lot of ways he really was an orphan boy.
Prince Philip was quite lucky to be educated by rich aunts like Marie Bonaparte, Princess George of Greece, and Lady Mountbatten, Lady Louis, who looked after him and the Werner family also. But then, of course, his mother fell ill with this kind of religious crisis, nervous breakdown in 1930 when he would only have been 8 or 9. And after that, he doesn't really have a mother. And indeed, he said once, "My mother was ill, my father was away, I just had to get on with it."
Hugo Vickers, biographer of Princess Alice. Her religious crisis was eventually resolved, and she became a nun. She later attended both Prince Philip's wedding and the Queen's coronation in Westminster Abbey. But it's worth reminding ourselves of those formative years when seeking to understand the decades that would follow. For now, as a boy, he'd be brought up by his mother's family, the Milford Havens. George Milford Haven, the second Marquis and Dickie Mountbatten's eldest brother, became a surrogate father. And when the Marquis died, Prince Philip was possessed of enormous grief. Grief, not dutiful sadness. And there were other strong, private emotions felt by this royal refugee. His friend and former president of the Royal Academy, Sir Hugh Casson.
He told me once that if you're in exile, you never, ever forget it, ever. And nobody who has been in exile, who is not allowed to go back to where he came from, has a lifetime of misery, which is rather unexpected from him, because I thought he didn't have all that affection for his country, but he said it's burned into you.
One of the accepted influences on Prince Philip was his time at the then newly founded public school Gordonston. Its principal, Kurt Hahn, had set it up in Scotland after fleeing Nazi Germany. Sir Ian Tennant was later a governor of that school.
He was a passionate man for fairness, for compassion, for adventure. He was a passionate man against bullying, against cruelty, against any form of inconsideration to others. And I think all these things did rub off on Prince Philip.
Hahn's sway was never underestimated. He found Philip often naughty but never nasty, and famously said, "His best is outstanding, his second best isn't good enough." It might have been Prince Philip's motto. The next stage in his life was crucial to the story of the British monarchy, and here one discerns the influence of his ambitious uncle, Dickie Mountbatten. It's 1939. Britain's about to go to war with Germany. Philip, still of Greece, is about to go to Dartmouth. He learns to march, stamp, salute, signal, double away to parades, duties and biddings. And then a moment of delight for his uncle. The King and Queen, with Uncle Dickie in attendance and the two princesses in tow, pay an official visit to the Naval College. They're to stay the weekend. It could have been just another royal visit, but, as naval historian Eric Grove explains, it passed into regal mythology rather than obscurity.
There was an epidemic of mumps. This meant that it was undesirable for the princesses to attend church on the morning of the second day of the visit, and so Prince Philip was detailed off to help the captain's family look after the princesses. We have quite a remarkable diary, a very good source on this, the captain's diary, and as he put it, the prince and his children had a good rag with the princesses that morning in the house. Then they had lunch at the captain's house, everyone, and the prince and the princesses sat side by side. Then in the afternoon, when the King and Queen went up to see the unfortunate cadets up in the hospital, they played croquet on the lawn, the prince and the princesses. And we have some photographs, one of which is particularly good, of the young princess gazing up at this handsome young officer, every little girl's idea of what a young naval officer should be like.
She had his photograph by her bedside throughout the war. But 18-year-old Philip had bigger things on his mind than 13-year-old princesses, not least the frustration that Greece remained neutral, and therefore the Navy had to keep him out of the war. Until, that is, the Germans marched into Greece. Prince Philip was to have what was then called a good war. He was mentioned in dispatches. Eric Grove again.
The Second World War was an enormous test for the Navy, a test which the Navy stood quite well. People were determined, I think, that the Navy was going to do better this time than it had done in the First World War. And when you look at the record of the fleet in the war, Prince Philip and his contemporaries did pretty well. He served in cruisers, he served in destroyers, he served along the east coast of England, but perhaps the most important battle he was involved in was when he was controlling the searchlights on board the battleship HMS Valiant at the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941. This was a night action, so control of the searchlights was absolutely crucial. So he did play a very significant role in one of the major naval victories of the Second World War.
Well, a minor hero, but Prince Philip would never be simply a naval officer, whatever his instincts and professionalism. His upbringing, an adventure playground for a genealogist, meant that whichever way he pulled, he couldn't escape that wiring diagram of court intrigue and opportunism. Dickie Mountbatten is said to have been determined that his young nephew would one day marry the heir to the throne. Sir Edward Ford, private secretary to King George VI and later to the Queen, remembers watching the gavotte of Mountbatten's matchmaking.
I don't think he engineered it, but it's almost certainly true that he had it in mind, and that no doubt he may have arranged for appropriate meetings. It was marvellous. Prince Philip was there, and she fell in love with him. She certainly did, because he did fit the bill, absolutely to a T.
Well, up to a point he did. There were well-recorded problems. Sensitivities surfaced over the German relations, as one member of the royal family called them. It was something Mountbatten understood all too well. His father, Louis Battenberg, had been forced to resign as First Sea Lord and change his name from Battenberg to Mountbatten because of anti-German sentiment in World War I. At the time their engagement was approved, the mark and memory of what some called the Second German War couldn't be ignored. Prince Philip's biographer, Tim Heald.
There was a lot of hostility to him early on. He was accepted, I think, very much by the king, who was kind to him and helped him. But there were other people, notably the Queen Mother's brother, for instance, who was very opposed to him on the grounds that he was not only a foreigner, but effectively a German, and a bit of a hustler. He was a pushy character. He clearly had views of his own, and he wanted to enforce them. So he wasn't easy, and a certain sort of, Princess Margaret once referred to them to me as the men with moustaches, and one knows what she meant. There was a certain sort of British establishment figure who was very hostile to him. So he was insecure from that point of view.
One obviously felt that he would bring in the outside world into that circle. And being very positive, he was going to say exactly what he thought, and I have no doubt it was very difficult at times for him. Very.
The Marquess of Milford Haven's niece, Myra Butter. She'd known Prince Philip since childhood.
You've got to look back always how you were at that time and how people thought at that time, and they've changed a good deal on the way. The courtiers obviously thought, who's this brash young man saying these things? Of course he was saying and thinking exactly what we talk about now, what young people do, you know. It's no different, really. But he was in there, and obviously he wasn't going to be somebody he wasn't. He said what he thought.
But strong will overcomes much, and in July 1947, the engagement was announced.
Have consented together in a holy wedlock.
They were married in November, after Prince Philip had given up any claim to the Greek throne, his title of Prince of Greece, his membership of the Greek Orthodox Church, and any ambition he may have had of a career in the Royal Navy.
I pronounce that they be man and wife together.
You're listening to a special BBC World Service programme on the life of Prince Philip. I'm Edward Sturton. Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten RN and Princess Elizabeth were married at a time of dramatic change in British society. The revolution, which had already taken its grip on industrial, economic and social life during the conflict, continued once the war was done. Labour winning by a landslide at the ballot box. The country broke. Bomb sites at every corner, a black market, ration books, a Soviet cordon, Churchill's Iron Curtain across Eastern Europe, the failure of the great powers to manage the peace where they had managed the war. Yet it was still a decade of hope. 2 tyrannies overcome, reform in education, the creation of the National Health Service, the establishment of the United Nations. The first breath of what Macmillan was later to call the wind of change, independence for India and Pakistan and Burma. The industrialist Sir Peter Parker was there.
We were feeling, I suppose, like a lot of ex-servicemen, that the country really did need stirring. I mean, we were all pretty tired. The war had exhausted us in so many different ways. There was the great achievement of the welfare state, but that's a static thing, that's safety. How do we somehow create an atmosphere that's brighter than that and more challenging than that, though in no way undermining it? And so the idea of an inspirational sense of industrial purpose, industry for man rather than man for industry, was a totally shared concept.
But the hopes to do something, to get things going, would have to wait. For the moment, at least, Prince Philip remained a naval officer and a good one, according to Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Lewin. He served with Philip during the war and later in the Mediterranean.
He was appointed first lieutenant of the destroyer Chequers, which was a flotilla leader. Being first lieutenant of the leader is quite a difficult job because all the other ships in the flotilla are trying to beat the leader. And usually they succeed. And the leader is usually unpopular. Prince Philip was, I should say, the most junior of all the first lieutenants. And so it could have been a disaster, but it wasn't. And he made the ship extremely smart and efficient without making himself unpopular. He went from Chequers to command Magpie. And there, I think, his determination to be a damn good naval officer really showed, because Magpie was an outstanding ship.
When he wasn't aboard ship or in a wardroom, home was Clarence House. Lady Abel Smith served the Queen from before her accession to the throne. She remembered a lively family atmosphere and a household run in true naval fashion.
He ran Clarence House like a ship. I mean, the captain of the ship knows the whole of his house and goes into every single room. No royal person had ever done. And I think the Queen was the first person to go into a housemaid's bedroom at Balmoral to find that there was one tap, no curtains along the passage, and had the whole place modernised, which was obviously the naval training coming out, you know. And he was very thoughtful that we all had fun and we were looked after.
Prince Philip's sense of justice and injustice was enhanced by his naval training. Look after your ship's company, then you can ask them to do the impossible. A combination of nous and leadership. All through his life, Philip would know how to get people to do things. Those early years were happy ones. In 1948, Charles was born. 2 years later, Princess Anne, the line of succession assured. But the easy days of a naval officer and their distractions from the pressures of court and constitutional life were drawing to a close. By 1951, King George was far from well, cancer. Prince Philip was recalled to London, and that was the end of his active naval career. Not that he ever lost touch with the maritime world. For instance, he was for 42 years Master of Trinity House, the body chartered in the reign of Henry VIII to be responsible for the maritime safety of seafarers. But back in the early 1950s, there was much for Prince Philip to do and much to learn. In 1951, Atlantic liners still steamed for the blue ribbon. Planes were called aircraft and had propellers. Sir George Everest's mountain remained unconquered. Few sitting rooms had a television, migrants lined up for £10 tickets, and a new life in Australia. It was time for a change. Step forward Philip the impatient, Philip the innovator. Where best to start? The palace, of course. His instinct was for change, not for the sake of it, but to use modern technologies and ideas to wider advantage. For example, when the king was too ill to make a state visit to Canada, it was agreed, at short notice, that the prince and princess must go in his stead. "We'll fly," said Prince Philip. "Oh no, you won't," said the court, the government, and anyone else likely to be consulted. "You'll go by sea." They flew. And this was indeed the dawning of a new Elizabethan age. News reached the travelling Princess Elizabeth in Kenya. The king is dead. Long live the Queen. Sir David Butter, Mountbatten's nephew by marriage, remembers this moment of transition.
It was difficult for both of them. To become queen at such a very young age, it must have been really quite a task. The whole of their life suddenly changed from being a very sort of, I wouldn't say ordinary couple, but I mean a sort of normal couple. Suddenly these tremendous responsibilities thrust on their shoulders much too early, in a way. They hadn't had a chance, really, to settle down.
I, Philip, will become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die.
Adaptable and professional and dutiful, but without the formal designation of Prince Consort.
You realised it from afar as much as from near how very different their lives were from previous year and how very difficult it all was, particularly, of course, for Prince Philip, because that was a new situation that hadn't arisen since the days of Queen Victoria, that there would be a queen regnant with a consort. And as everybody, I think, now well knows, life was very difficult for him.
His cousin, Countess Mountbatten of Burma.
I think it's perhaps natural. There's a sort of slight feeling of resentment amongst the officials that a usurper, in the sense that, they're really looking after the monarch and who is this other person and where should he be in the setup. He was marvellous at being terribly careful in no way to impinge on the fact that the Queen was the Queen. But it was quite a long time before he was given his rightful due, I think.
Victoria's Prince Consort, Albert, had a constitutional power. The Duke of Edinburgh, as he then was, had none. He wasn't privy to state secrets, and there's no evidence that he wanted to be. But that doesn't mean that he didn't want something to do, and the recognition that he had a contribution to make to the monarchy, and therefore to the country. There's a higgledy-piggledy element to all royal portfolios. The Duke's had been filling up steadily since his marriage, from the Chancellorship of the University of Wales to the presidency of the National Playing Fields Association. Now he began to assemble a list of literally hundreds of patronages and presidencies. But there were perhaps three strands of interest, three constants, which he decided from the word go wouldn't just be hobbies. Each time he was asked to say something on these subjects, he made sure he had something to say.
The standard of intelligence, competence, and workmanship in industry, commerce, and agriculture controls absolutely the ability of any country to hold its own in the highly competitive business of international trade. Following from this, it should be obvious that a country's competitive position in world markets is what ultimately controls the comfort and prosperity of the people.
My own impression is that the gathering awareness of ordinary people in all countries will make it essential for governments to take the problems of conservation seriously before very long. I don't think this reflects a new and an enlarged capacity for worry. It's simply that we have got something new to worry about. The philosophy of this scheme is neither very profound nor very complicated. It's simply this, that a civilized society depends on the freedom, the responsibility, the intelligence, and the standard of behavior of its individual members. And if the society is to continue to be civilized, each succeeding generation must learn to value these qualities and standards for themselves.
Today, unremarkable thoughts from royalty. 60-odd years ago, quite another matter. His concepts of social rights and wrongs were established. His thoughts on industry were honed in an increasingly technical Royal Navy, which, after all, had been the first to use computers. Prince Philip's instinct that people should talk to each other, so that industry and communities shouldn't work in isolation, never left him. Sir Peter Parker.
And it's interesting because it was saying it against the grain of that time. Quite a difficult job to do that. And he articulated that message, and we all felt we were the advance guard of something which was balancing human and social values against material values. We've got to strike that balance for a healthy community. But he was a generation ahead and pioneering these subjects.
Perhaps a better-known strand was his interest in wildlife and conservation. Indeed, Prince Philip's passions for conservation and environmental protection were to prove world-leading. But to start with, they were far from fashionable, as we'll be hearing shortly here on the BBC World Service. I'm Edward Sturton, presenting a special programme on the life of Prince Philip, whose death has been announced by Buckingham Palace. Welcome back to this special programme about the life of Prince Philip, the husband of Britain's Queen Elizabeth. I'm Edward Sturton. There are those who've never reconciled Prince Philip's passion for shooting with his equal passion for preserving wildlife. Aubrey Buxton, the naturalist filmmaker, was duck shooting with Prince Philip when he realised his companion had other thoughts on his mind.
I do remember that morning when I think he'd hardly had a shot and there were hardly any duck. The most glorious morning, sunshine and blue skies, and he told me he'd had a marvellous time watching a pair of goldfinches. And that's when I discovered that he was really quite keen on watching behaviour particularly, and not just recognising things, which came as quite a surprise, because although he liked the countryside, I don't think he'd ever taken much notice of it before. And having a very keen and inquisitive mind, he's never prepared to simply sit still with the status quo, so to speak, and just continue as a birdwatcher. He immediately goes from there to habitat and conservation and wanting to see them abroad and understand migration and all that sort of thing. And that led, over a period of about a decade, into him becoming keenly interested in the whole problem of the countryside and nature conservation worldwide.
In 1961, Sir Peter Scott invited him to become the first British president of the World Wildlife Fund. Sir Peter was staggered when he sent Prince Philip the draft charter, just something to mull over, perhaps. Oh no. Within a week, back came a 4-page memorandum in the Prince's own hand.
You see, he says, thank you for your note and the enclosures. I think they all make sense except the charter. I'm afraid I find it unconvincing, confused, and frankly badly written. I'm sure you could do better than that. As it stands, I'm sure it will put off a great many people who would otherwise be all for preservation. And then he says to go through it paragraph by paragraph. One, I think you must state the threats to wildlife before going into the moral arguments. Two, this is a negative approach. I would emphasize that wildlife... And it goes up to 8. To be honest, I would suggest you tear the whole thing up and start again.
Well, Prince Philip's passions were never short-lived. President of the Fund for 20 years, then its international president from 1981. Prince Philip saw nature conservation into the very heart of serious debate. And for 20 years he was the president of the International Equestrian Federation, which controls pretty much everything horsey except racing. He was driving a 4-in-hand well into his 90s. But it was in 1956 that the Duke of Edinburgh launched his award scheme. Its aim to give every youngster the chance to do something without being forced to, and at the end of it, to have a sense of achievement. Here's its one-time director, Major General Michael Hobbs.
He isn't just a leader of a thing. He took enormous trouble in creating a structure which would survive. How many youth organisations are formed in one year and die in the next? And the subtlety of it is that he's got this extraordinary structure across the whole country, which he personally devised down to the last word.
As Michael Hobbs says, the scheme has survived and is successful worldwide, with more than 8 million young people having received awards in 144 countries. But in Britain, rather like Prince Philip himself, it didn't always have the backing of the establishment. It took a long time for it to shed its image as being a scheme for the sons and daughters of the middle classes. That certainly hadn't been what the Prince intended.
He had to have the idea, create the formula, but he couldn't physically get into the sort of arguments, public arguments, that would have been necessary to either encourage it in certain areas or to discourage it in others. He always quotes that when he went to the Education Ministry and said, "Here is the scheme," later the Secretary of State, who will remain forever nameless, turned to him and said, "I hear you have invented something rather like the Hitler Youth." Now that to him was an appalling insult, A, because it was palpably not what had happened, and B, it was, as it were, a racial insult. It was implying that he was bringing something over. Remember, it's still very close to the war. So he never stopped thinking that government was not going to be his friend over this.
Philip had, after all, publicly decided to do something for British youth which government wasn't doing. The mandarins and the courtiers had already done their best to put him in his place, most firmly after the death of George VI. In 1953, his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, was said to have claimed that the royal house was now his house, the House of Mountbatten. Philip told Churchill he thought it should be the House of Edinburgh. "Never, never, never," replied the constitutional establishment. It was Churchill who made certain that the Queen understood her family was the House of Windsor. On April the 9th that year, it duly became so by royal proclamation. Prince Philip's expression of disappointment was somehow typical. He was, he remarked to a friend, left as nothing more than an amoeba, a bloody amoeba. Countess Mountbatten of Burma.
Suddenly, his own children were no longer to bear his own name. And that was a terrible blow, it would be for any father and any husband. And I think that arose because Churchill, with his historical sense, wanting the House of Windsor to be established, gave the Queen bad advice on that one, to the extent that the name should be changed. And being a very dutiful monarch, I think she felt that she should accept that advice, perhaps without having quite realised the psychological blow it would be to her husband.
It's difficult to appreciate the pressures on the royal family, and so there were rumours, especially around this time, of strains between the Queen and Prince Philip. These persisted during the Duke's extended tour to Australia in the Royal Yacht Britannia. A long time away, birthdays, state occasions and Christmas all missed. And in 1956 there was the saga of Mike Parker, Prince Philip's longtime naval friend and equerry. Parker, beneath his sense of naval discipline and duty, was a particularly irreverent Australian and had been with Prince Philip from his earliest days at the palace. Together they were a formidable, fun-loving team.
Live it up, live it up, live it up, live it up, have yourself a ball.
The end came with Parker's very public divorce. The Queen was advised, Parker went. An eventful year, but at the end of it, as if to sweep aside once and for all any chatter about rifts and tensions, the Duke of Edinburgh was confirmed as First Gentleman of the Realm when the Queen dubbed him Prince. It was now that the Prince went to work on some of the stuffiness which hung heavily in the corridors of the royal household. And when, in the 1980s, the Lord Chamberlain, Lord Airlie, oversaw a comprehensive reorganisation in the way it was run and financed, he acknowledged the steps, albeit small ones, made by Prince Philip.
He did bring a fresh view to the direction in which the monarchy should be going and the way in which the household was managed. And I think that was probably very timely at the time. And then times moved on, and perhaps the 80s has been another period when it needed to be looked at. And again, he's been enormously supportive. And I think it's fair to say that in many instances, the Queen would defer to him, ask him to deal with me direct in relation to a number of different issues that needed to be addressed.
There are very few facets of the business of royalty which he has not actually been involved in some way or another.
Brigadier Sir Miles Hunt Davis, his former private secretary.
He can actually see how things perhaps should develop.
Always an ideas man, curiosity, imagination. The Prince had been Ranger of Windsor Great Park since early in the Queen's reign, an office also held by Prince Albert when he was Prince Consort to Queen Victoria. Courtesy title? Well, tell that to Roland Wiseman, the Deputy Ranger.
He got very interested in converting the manure from our 2 dairy herds to anaerobically digest the manure and produce methane gas, because he thought, why buy gas from the gas board if you can produce your own from the cow manure? Well, we whacked away at this for ages and ages and ages. It's almost become a joke, because I would say, well, I'm terribly sorry, sir, we're still working on it. But at the end of the day, it's there.
Though not without further heartache, as the Prince himself revealed.
That great tank there is the remains of an attempt to have a biogas plant. Unfortunately, while they were doing something to it, the digester blew up, so we had to get rid of it. It's quite difficult to get it right.
Interestingly, this sort of thing brought Philip up against the contemporary champions of green issues, whether it be over the merits of wind farms or, as here, the replanting of trees in Windsor Great Park.
All hell broke loose amongst the tree huggers and all the people who thought we were destroying the oak trees. I mean, can you imagine? There were a few decrepit old things and a few that were planted in the wrong place. It seemed absolutely crazy not to straighten it out. We planted 1,000 oaks, so what's wrong with that?
Prince Philip, whenever he wanted, could surround himself with experts, but he lacked many close friends. Few could keep up with the range of his interests. His private office, along the Privy Purse corridor in Buckingham Palace, had to. Very small, run like a well-founded frigate. One of the busiest periods was in the 1990s. Sir Brian McGrath was his treasurer, and Sir Miles Hunt Davis his private secretary. It was then that they spoke together about the Prince's approach to work.
You made a mistake, then say, look, sir, I made a nonsense of that, or whatever it is. Oh, I don't think so. No, not really. We can do it that way.
And if there is a hitch, it turns into almost fast because of his sense of humour. I mean, he doesn't sort of throw a wobbler because the car's late, or sometimes he leaves early. He has been known to leave before everybody in the household's actually there. And I mean, you know, not done deliberately, but if he's got to be there at a time, of course the individual concerned is in a frightful state, but actually Prince Philip just thinks it's highly amusing. I suppose honesty, therefore, and punctuality might be the other.
But also, sticking to your guns. If you think that something should not be done, you're looking at a speech and something could be misconstrued or what have you, you say so, and he genuinely wants to know what you think. And if you say, I don't think you should do that, or whatever it may be, you immediately change it.
Few had insights into Prince Philip. The ones who'd got close enough to him were loyal to him, and his rule of loyalty meant that while they felt more and more strongly that Prince Philip wasn't given his due, they would never publicly say what they knew. Even the 1960s television programme Royal Family didn't much change the public view of the Prince. 40 years later, the film The Queen reinforced the stereotype of the conservative and intolerant Philip, while most recently The Crown brought a fictional dimension to its portrayal. The media revolution, which had started with the televising of the coronation in 1953, meant that the public just went along with these preconceptions. Why? Well, their focus had shifted, first to Charles and more recently to William and Harry. Prince Philip's news ratings had slipped, unless, that is, he produced one of his gaffes.
Once I saw her pull a face a little bit at one of Prince Philip's characteristic. He meant well, but it was just an amazing thing to say.
Lord Runcie, former Archbishop of Canterbury.
At a state banquet, the Archbishop, by protocol, is the first to be introduced to the current head of state. Sometimes the head of state is a bit surprised to be introduced to a figure in silk stockings and a purple coat and a clerical collar on, you see. So it was one of the Arab rulers and the Queen, said the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Philip, to help him, leant forward and said, "He's our Ayatollah, you know." I passed on hastily.
I'm Edward Sturton, and this is a special BBC World Service programme on the life of Prince Philip. In 1969, when the British economy was again on its uppers, Prince Philip publicly remarked that something had to be done about the civil list, or he'd have to sell his polo ponies. Not a tactful remark, but these East End dockers took his point.
Having given us a great deal of incentive about 15 years ago with the boys' clubs and that, we just thought we'd sort of send him a little present of some kind, maybe a big present, we don't know yet, and give him some incentive to carry on with his sport.
If he's short, it's not quite the same as other people being short.
No, I mean, he's done something for us, now we're just going to do something for him. Everyone's having a pop at the fellow lately, so we're just going to show him there's someone who's behind him for a change. One of the only monarchists ever got up and spoke his mind. We like that.
Why not? There was always something about him that understood people under pressure and how to relieve some of it. It was his naval background. Very important to see that as more than gold stripes and the rows of medals. The round-the-world yachtsman Sir Robin Knox-Johnston worked with him in the Sail Training Association and at the Maritime Museum at Greenwich.
I've always thought, you know, that with the dislocated childhood he must have had, his first real home, where he first had real security, was when he joined the Royal Navy. And it always used to annoy me. He'd come out with a jocular remark, which was absolutely typical of something you'd hear on the lower deck in the Navy. And, of course, the newspapers would go for him.
For example?
Well, I mean, when he visited China and he said to people, "How long have you been here?" And he said, "You don't want to stay much longer, you know, you'll get narrowed eyes." On the lower deck in the Royal Navy, that would be a good joke, wouldn't it? You'd say it as a funny joke. You wouldn't particularly mean it. It was just a funny thing to say. And Jolly Jack would go right back and say, "Oh, Sir came up with a good one." And we'd all have a laugh about it. And that's one of the way you built up the camaraderie between the officers and the men. Any of us who've been at sea sort of said, "Well, it's funny, but it's not serious."
Except that the Prince wasn't Jolly Jack ashore. He was one of the most potent symbols of modern royalty, and therefore vulnerable. What's more, he believed in the symbolism of royalty, and that required circumspection, the lack of which was made all too painfully clear in the public humiliation of his children's failed marriages and the circumstances of those humiliations. Take, for example, the Princess of Wales, as she then was, Diana's biographer, Sarah Bradford.
Prince Philip liked Diana, and he tried to jolly her along. You know, he'd whirl her into the dining room when she came down all depressed after being sick or ill or something like that. And he'd write her one of his helpful letters on his famous laptop. I think that he began to lose patience with her. But I think he always felt a certain amount of sympathy, and perhaps he even felt that, after all, he had been partly responsible for the marriage in the way that I think he did push Prince Charles into this marriage.
That lost patience was underlined when letters from Prince Philip to Diana were cited at the very public inquest into the deaths of Diana and her companion, Dodi Al-Fayed. Slowly, though, calm was restored. When Camilla Parker Bowles' status had been accepted by her marriage to Prince Charles in 2005, another embarrassing issue for both the Queen and Prince Philip had been resolved. at least on the surface. And after that, as often happens with popular attitudes to the royal family, public opinion shifted. Anyway, for Philip, there were still such monarchical verities as a sense of duty. His biographer, Tim Heald.
A very strong sense that being royal made you in some way different, mainly in the sense that it did oblige you to do certain things. And I think that one of the things that distressed him most about the relative disintegration of the royal family, particularly of the younger members, was that seemed to involve a dereliction of duty, that, there were certain things that you bloody well, as he would say, get on and do. And I think that the fact that they didn't seem to be doing that riled him a lot.
Was he an impatient sailor all his life? Some wondered whether he actually liked his children. Sarah Bradford again.
Prince Philip was much maligned as a father. I think when the children were small, he was actually more paternal than the Queen was maternal. He loved playing with the children. I think as the children grew up, things became more difficult, particularly between Prince Philip and the Prince of Wales. I think they were very different characters. And, of course, Prince Philip expected more of the Prince of Wales because the Prince of Wales was the heir to the throne. And I think that he was quite tough and demanding and critical.
With all these pressures, Prince Philip could have easily retired to Sandringham and Balmoral and Buckingham Palace for state occasions. But he didn't. That wasn't his style. And anyway, in 2011, the royal family show was back on the road. In April that year, Prince William married Catherine Middleton.
The Rolls-Royce has just emerged from the right-hand gates of Buckingham Palace, and you can hear the response of the crowds as that car moves slowly past with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh in that back seat.
It was shortly afterwards, on the eve of his 90th birthday, that Prince Philip did announce a scaling back in his activities, but done on his own terms and in his own way.
I reckon I've done my bit. I want to enjoy myself from now. With less responsibility, less frantic rushing about, less preparation, less trying to think of something to say. On top of that, your memory's going. Yes, I'm just sort of winding down.
And then, at the age of 96, came the announcement that, from the summer of 2017, he would no longer carry out solo public duties. His final engagement took place in pouring rain on the parade ground at Buckingham Palace and was marked by the band of the Royal Marines in fitting style. Time to ease up. As his navy would say, time to make and mend. Time to take more care. In January 2019, while driving close to the Sandringham estate, he was involved in an accident in which 2 other motorists were injured. He could have been prosecuted, but wasn't. For much of his time in public life, he missed little. He constantly was asking why, seemingly born with the need to sort things out. Brigadier Clive Robertson, his assistant private secretary throughout the 1980s, has a favourite memory of the boss in action in far-off Madagascar.
The World Bank were going to give some money to improve things in the island if they would agree to having a conservation strategy. At that time, the island was really being destroyed. The whole of the north was suffering from what they call slash and burn. They cut down the trees, the rains would come down, the topsoil would be swept away, out down to the rivers and out to sea. And he didn't think that some of the members of the government believed this. And so he said, right, he said, I'll show you what's happening to your island. You come with me. And he took them up in the old Andover in those days and flew over the northern part of the island. And it was very, very vivid and very stark. Here was all this water rushing down the rivers, bright red because the silt was red in that part of the world, coming out to sea. He said, look down there. He said, you're bleeding your home. You're bleeding your island to death. And I always thought that was a very good example of him bringing together politics, the environment, conservation, and very real leadership.
A man of tremendous ideas, intelligence and energies. But with all the things that he did, how do we assess his achievements? His friends and the people he worked with will tell you the public only knew a tiny amount of what he did for his country and the world. He never believed in the obvious. Take, for example, the universal acceptance of the Global Positioning System, GPS, that constellation of satellites that tell us exactly where we are on Earth. As Master of Trinity House, he was infuriated that people didn't understand what would happen if GPS was shut down. Rear Admiral Sir Jeremy de Halpert was Prince Philip's Deputy Master at Trinity House.
Prince Philip, from the very beginning, understood that it was a single point of failure. GPS can be jammed very easily. And if you jam GPS, you not only lose your position, but you also lose the timing signal that goes to banking, internet, mobile phones, hospital machinery, traffic light systems, national grid, and so on and so on. So critical infrastructure around the country falls over. And he encouraged us to move ahead and make sure that the country has a fail-safe backup, which we have done, and it is now operational.
But the inevitable question about the man was, what would have happened to him if he'd not married Princess Elizabeth? Lord Mountbatten once said he believed that Prince Philip most certainly would have become First Sea Lord, and then added, should we have wished. But perhaps it's too easy to suggest that a man in his position had to have achievements which we could all evaluate. His blue plaques are rather the people he motivated, and they're not necessarily high officers of state or personal friends. They're far more likely to be the scientists and industrialists he made to stop and think, youngsters with certificates and medals for his award, delegates from around the world coming together at one of his Commonwealth study groups. But the lasting memory of Prince Philip must be his partnership with the Queen.
It's been a challenge for us, but by trial and experience, I believe we have achieved a sensible division of labour and a good balance between our individual and joint interests. Because after 50 years of experience, I find there's a great temptation to give advice. The trouble is that no two marriages are quite alike. However, I think that the main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
Prince Philip remained a constant in the Queen's life. He was one of the few in the family who recognised that, while she personally was very popular, that alone wouldn't be enough to secure the future of the monarchy. As the marriages of their children demonstrated, the modern institution was fallible and had to accept its fallibility. It didn't find it easy. The comfortable adaptations were past. Could it still have meaning to the nation and retain a dignified role in the Constitution? With Prince Philip's death, those questions remain, but at a personal level, he did succeed in showing the continued relevance of traditional values. From decade to decade, royal birthday to royal birthday, he made it his role to support the Queen. Such loyalty and steadfastness were sometimes mocked as unfashionable, but that perhaps was precisely their point, as the monarch, above all, recognised.
He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
This has been a special programme here on the BBC World Service about Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth, whose death has been announced. It was presented by me, Edward Sturton, and the editor was Hugh Levinson.